Luann, I'm really curious about how you came to faith, like what that journey was like for you.
Yeah, I grew up in a non-religious family. My parents grew up in Mao era China, so they were pretty strongly discouraged not to believe that there was anything outside of material existence. And so growing up, I moved to the United States when I was 3 and lived in Southern California and Southeast Texas. But I mainly got the idea that our bodies and what we see in front of us is all there is to life. And so it's really important then to make your body, in the best shape possible and keep your health. But then when we moved to Southeast Texas, my parents started a Chinese restaurant there, and I was one of maybe two other Asian kids in school, and I got invited to church by one of my friends. So that's when I started being exposed to the Christian message. And it was just all around me. Obviously, we were in the Bible Belt and everybody believed in God. And so for me, when they asked me, do you want to accept Jesus into your life? It was sort of like, oh, do you want to belong? So I was like, sure, I'll do that. And so it's really interesting to think about the ways that God just takes you into his family and in ways and the methods might not be the most or the motivation might not be the most like I'm doing this because I believe and
Hmm.
the or I don't even know what I believe. But once once I was in the church and started, I got like this new disciple packet of fill in the blanks of like what is sin and what did Jesus come to do. And so I went through all that and looked up all the Bible verses, and that was kind of the start of my journey. And amazingly, I stuck with it and ended up going to Wheaton College in Wheaton, Illinois for my undergrad. So that's the beginning of the journey. So I'll stop there.
How did your family react to you like getting involved in a Christian church and um, kind of pursuing that, and then even going further to even go to a Christian college? That's a big deal, huge investment.
Mhm. They didn't like it. Was when I started going to church, I also started wanting to give money to the church, and that was really disturbing to my mom. I remember like folding laundry and having conversations with her about how she thought I shouldn't be like kind of going into this like what she felt like was a cult where they were taking my money and kind of
Hmm.
I was basing all of my kind of hopes and dreams on this message and this specific system of beliefs. So she strongly discouraged me from going to church. She kind of felt like I was like in over my head, like I was just doing this
Sure.
thing because I wanted to be part of something bigger than me. But
Right.
it didn't have any grounding in reality. So she was worried that I would get lost in that. And there were definitely like moments where I would say things because I was in like my Jesus freak period of like just
Hmm.
being really passionate. And I would say like, I don't need to like get a job. God's going to take care of me. So I went to the other extreme because my mom was so practical and I wanted to like push against that. Um,
Yeah.
and then when I went to Wheaton College, that was not what they had in mind either. They wanted me to go to Ivy League school, and that's what they were hoping. And I got a full scholarship to Wheaton, but they said, we'll pay for you to go to Columbia or Stanford instead of Wheaton. But I still went to Wheaton, so they're okay with
Wow.
it now. I mean, my I'm not like destitute or anything. So
What drove your decision to go to Wheaton? You had so many options.
yeah, I think the idea of having a Christian community, I uh, I've always felt like an outsider, being from an immigrant family, and so that vision of being in close Christian community was what drove me to go there, and I did end up finding that, although the first semester was really challenging because I was not even familiar with the term evangelical before I went to Wheaton College. So it was a big culture shock to go from my Chinese immigrant family and in Southeast Texas, where there's is a very narrow segment of the evangelical faith and the church. So going to Wheaton, it was challenging on a number of levels.
Was it like just the exposure to different types of Christian denominations that was like, oh wow, this is a lot bigger than I thought?
Yeah, that was part of the challenge, and part of it was also the not being culturally competent in the evangelical world. So I felt like I didn't catch the jokes that people were telling, and that I didn't come from a family of faith. So there was so much that people were talking about that I felt that was foreign to me.
Hmm. Can you share like an example of like what you mean by kind of the evangelical language that's being used and you're like feeling like out of the loop?
I can't think of anything that comes to mind. There were just so many jokes about, they had this board up at the college post office where they would post um, all these like really like kind of erudite jokes about theology, and or they would talk about like modesty, and there's always these like ongoing wars about are girls being modest enough, or are we like completely misunderstanding what modesty is. And I just had no background to even begin to like engage in those
Hmm.
conversations very well. So I feel like I was just learning all of this new language and background about what people were like, what was important to people, and the questions that my peers were asking. So I was very quiet for the first few semesters at Wheaton.
And what were you studying at Wheaton?
I started out being a history major, but before I even took a history class, I got roped into taking an anthropology class from my professor named Brian Howell, who's still a good friend of mine. And that's what got me interested in anthropology. I think the idea of an anthropologist as this participant observer, as both being outside and yet sort of inside, and looking into the inside from the outside, and stepping back and being able to say things about what they see, really fascinated me because it resonated so much with my own experience of growing up in the United States.
At what period did you like start to think about like becoming a writer and starting to like you're studying anthropology, you're studying culture, being the outsider, being an insider. What at what point did you start to like think about writing for
Hmm.
yourself and maybe even writing books?
Yeah, I had been in the newspaper staff in high school, so journalism was always a possibility for me. And then once I started going down the anthropology path, I figured I would go get a PhD and go on to teach and write academic books. And that's still a possibility. But when I got a master's at the University of Chicago. So when I finished that, I realized that I wanted to write for a larger audience. So that's when I started pitching articles to different publications. And that started me down the path of being a freelance writer and then writing this book that we're going to be talking about.
You talk about early on in your book about working at a nonprofit,
Hmm.
and when you finished at Wheaton and were I'm not sure at what point you went to work at a nonprofit. Was it after your undergraduate work or after your graduate work?
Yeah, right after I graduated from Wheaton.
What drove you down the nonprofit route?
I think it was sort of a holding place for me as I was trying to figure out uh, what do I want to study in graduate school. So it was mainly that. Just I found that job, and it seemed to fit with my skill set at the moment. Yeah, but I've also always been I think a lot of Wheaton College students and maybe just a lot of like millennial Christians in general are really passionate about social justice and kind of like helping and making the world
Hmm.
better. So that was part of it as well.
So your book um, gets into the pain that you started to feel in your ankle, and this begins like basically the story of your book and you talking about pain and how it impacted you and how it impacts you today. Um, I wonder if we can start off with that point where you're realizing that this is not just like a sprained ankle. This is more than that. And that frustration you were feeling with, you're trying to communicate the best you can with the doctors and the specialists about this pain. And you're being kind of written off of, well, just take some Tylenol. This is kind of maybe in your mind, like just walk and you'll get through this. There's nothing, we're not seeing anything in the x-rays. We're not seeing anything in the MRIs. Like this is, we're not quite sure what to do with this. Can you talk a little bit about that place of just
Hmm.
being misunderstood by
Hmm.
the medical community and maybe even also by your close friends or church community?
Hmm. Yeah. So for me, when I started realizing maybe this isn't going to be something, this pain isn't going to be something that's going to go away in a couple weeks or even a couple months, I really felt like because I'd relied so much on my body being able to do things for me that this was really something was wrong and I really wanted to be fixed and get better. And so when I approached doctors, I think I had this illusion that going to the doctor was going to fix me. And I think that's a common, like, when we go to the doctor, we kind of put doctors on pedestals and expect that they'll have all the answers. And that's not the case for so many people living with chronic pain or illness. They realize that doctors are really making educated guesses at at what's going on, like they can't see inside your body, even though we have MRIs and X-rays. So we kind of think that if we have the right knowledge, then we'll be able to master the body. And that realization that maybe doctors really don't know what's going on was really hard. And also getting the message from them, like you said, just got a lot of just take some Tylenol and give it some time, or it'll be okay. So that sort of made me feel like I was just overreacting, and this is like all in my head, and even from and I think I was a little bit in some ways overreacting. I mean, not to minimize the emotional turmoil I was going through, but I was so young and I had such a very small slice of the experience of what it means to live in a human body, which was had all been so good up until that point and so easy. So that coming up against pain and limits and the realization that uh, sometimes your body doesn't cooperate and sometimes like you get really stuck and you can't do all the things that you want to do. I had a really hard time with that, and like 10 years down the road from that, I think I would have a different reaction having sort of experienced like a broader scope of what is a normal human experience. So that feeling of like feeling like I was abnormal was part of that isolation and part of the turmoil.
Yeah, and you mentioned something about that feeling of the self questioning and wondering, is this all in my head? And that's like really hard because you're experiencing this pain, you know that it's real, but then when you have these authority figures, the doctors telling you like, no, actually, there's nothing going on here, and that's a really hard place to be in because now when you start questioning yourself, you can feel like, am I going crazy? Like, why, like, I know I'm feeling pain, but they're telling me that
Mhm.
it's not real or it's all in my head.
Right. I mean, I don't think they ever like specifically said it's all in your head, but there was nothing they could. I mean, there were some diagnoses that I got, but the treatments, they didn't really address my my pain. So whenever whenever they kind of said, well, we don't really see anything that we can do anything about,
Yeah.
um, that made me feel like, okay, well, I guess I just don't have help. So that feeling of kind of not having people to walk alongside me was really challenging. I think it would have been different if I had started out at a doctor where they were willing to say, okay, well, we tried this and it didn't work. And so let's try this and let's keep looking into this. But I got a lot of just like, okay, that's all we can do, dismissal. So then I would go to the next doctor and
Mm.
tell them my story all over again. But eventually I did find some doctors that were more of a partnership relationship that I felt like weren't just going to say, like, drop me and say, well, that's it. And uh, that's it. So I was able to keep going back to some doctors. And I think that's like the thing about uh, like these chronic conditions is that you need people that are like problem solving with you, like kind of in it for the long haul with you. And I don't think we have that in a lot of the way that American medicine works. It's about like quick fixes, and there's like people aren't talking to each other within the fields, the different fields. So there's like not like, unless you have like a really good like primary care doctor who's like willing to kind of put together all the pieces for you, you're kind of like doing it on your own, trying to put together all the pieces of what all the specialists are saying.
I feel like what you're saying about this, the medical field, it's so hard because some doctors are so busy just trying to solve cases, move on to the next patient. They have so many patients to be meeting with, and
Hmm.
you're one of them. And that they can't find like the problem on the X-ray or the MRI. There's not much they can do. They can refer you to
Hmm.
another specialist. Um,
Hmm.
but yeah, it does take a special type of doctor to like sit with
Hmm.
you, listen, and spend more than the 10 minutes that they're supposed to be in that room with you to
Hmm.
actually like kind of like, I'm going to be with you during this process. Check in with me in a month. Like, let's talk more. Let's do some more tests. It takes a special
Yeah.
doctor to do that.
Yeah, that it means so much for patients. Like when I was speaking with different people who lived with chronic illness for my book and interviewing them, that moment when they found that doctor, the one who would actually hear their story and look them in the eye and just receive that story without needing to, even if they didn't have a fix, or even if they weren't the ones who gave them the real diagnosis, that feeling of being accompanied is so important. And I understand that it takes so much emotional energy to do that, why doctors are unable to give that a lot of the time. And it's hard to be that involved in your patients' lives. Like if you did that for every patient, I think um, I don't know. I don't know what has to change within medicine to make that relationship different.
And tell me like how you were processing this mentally, because this is all happening to you physically at the same time, like you're having limitations now on how much you can walk, and you talk about like you love the outdoors, you like to be able to go out and hike, and now you're like limited to where you can walk and what you can actually do, and you're realizing that this is now going to change like your life potentially. So can you kind of share a little bit more like how you were kind of coping with this mentally?
Hmm. Well, I didn't do a great job with that at the beginning. I mean, and maybe I shouldn't say that because I think the responses that I had were normal actually, and maybe they were part of what I needed to go through in order to get to that more like integrative and accepting stage. So I went through, depression and anxiety and anger, knowing that I would be it was a feeling of grief, right? And there's like the stages of grief that people go through, and denial, bargaining. There was a lot of that with God, like or just not bargaining, but at least saying like what do I do? Like just show me the next step. I just want to know what I need to do next, and that I'm on the right path. And I didn't get that from God. What I got was you're going to be okay, in a deeper sense of being okay than like, not your body's going to be okay, like okay, and you're never going to experience pain again, but just that God's going to be present with me, and there are people that He's put around me that are going to be there for me, and I'm going to be okay because I'm supported, and I'm like, I'll be caught by people even if I feel like I'm free falling. There'll be people there.
I think that's like those periods where you're suffering physically, you're maybe not getting the support from the medical community, maybe not even getting support from certain friends at church, or friends in your life who maybe are like even questioning, like, oh, I wonder how much he's really in pain. Like that can
Hmm.
be very, very hurtful. And then on top of that, you have that faith dynamic of like doubting God, angry at God, like, why are you doing this to me? What did I do? Like, start to just question. And sometimes you start to like, oh, I did all these things. Like, I was like, I served in a nonprofit. I went to a Christian college. You start to like, not that you're thinking that that adds any sort of more favor, but you're still like, look, I've lived a good life. And like, why is this happening to me? What did I do to deserve this?
Hmm.
Um, and that just complicates the pain, makes it even worse. That anxiety is
Yes.
like, right, it becomes more and more, I think,
Right.
for the person who's like wanting to trust in God.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. I write in the book that the mental and emotional pain was really worse than the physical pain, because that sense, I guess, of feeling like things weren't right, and that there's something I had to do to make it right, and then not knowing what that thing was what is that gap between like reality and expectations that really kind of took me down that rabbit hole of like the despair and the darkness. And I think, like, the dark night of the soul, that's just a normal part of the spiritual journey, like an expected part of the spiritual journey. But I guess I didn't expect that, that it would just come in the way it did. Um, yeah.
Yeah, and I think part of that dark night is um, some of the hard parts are when you're losing close relationships or you're not feeling as connected anymore because you're no longer able to go on those outings or be part of certain community groups because you're just not feeling well enough, or and you start to lose those connections, and that can be a very, very painful period as well. Like you're so close to somebody, but now like you're not able to do those things or see them as often because of the pain that you're in.
Hmm. Yeah. And even like at church, the fact that I couldn't stand for communion and I didn't want to tell everybody that I was like going through this pain, and I didn't know if it would go away. So it felt like I didn't want to, like, be on the like be the one that was always on the prayer list. Like, these are the suffering people in our church, and let's like keep praying for them. Oh, they're still not better. Let's keep praying for them. And so, like, for me, like, so much of my identity had been like, I'm like the kind of the part of the church that's well and like giving and like stable and certain about things. So then to be on the kind of the like, oh, these are like the people that um their faith is kind of like shaky or whatever, they need some
Hmm.
help. It was a really disorienting experience for me.
I see you like very much a giver, and especially like going to a Christian college and then like going to do nonprofit work, which is very, very difficult work. You're basically giving of yourself, your time, your energy. You're passionate about the mission of the nonprofit, and now when you're in a place of being hurt, now you're having to like be a receiver, and that can be very, very hard for those who are givers to like be at a place of like, oh, now I need someone to help me. I need to be on the prayer list now. I don't like being on that list. I want to be on the opposite side. I get joy out of giving. I don't get joy out of like receiving or getting
Yes.
help.
Yeah, and we can place so much value within the church on the giving, and not the receiving. And then for people that are constantly receiving, it becomes like this, like, "Oh, I think I've met my quota of all the things that I can receive." Um, I guess like, how many times can you ask to get a meal delivered to you, or
Hmm.
just have someone come and clean your house when you can't do it yourself? So that becomes just this like sense of like, oh, I don't want to like burden this relationship anymore by asking
Right.
one more time, or I have to cancel on you. I'm so flaky. And so it really it challenges what we, even in the church, as much as we talk about everybody is valuable because they're a child of God. Yet when we think about ministry and who stands in front, it's givers, right? And it's people that are able to kind of like step up, and then when you can't and you have limits, you can feel like you maybe don't have a role in the church other than being ministered to. And that's one of the things that I started to question, like, okay, if we can't do things, then what is our
Mm.
vocation in the world? Is it just about the things that we can do, or is there something to just being, human and presence, and just bringing your presence that's enough to as a gift to people? And I've read a lot of disability theology while I was writing this book and thinking about, what is vocation when, and if our bodies are part of who we are, and our bodies are can be so limited in many ways that kind of like keep us from doing what we think we want to do in life. Um, do like, what is vocation? And one of the theologians I really appreciate is Joyce Mercer. Um, she teaches at Yale and has talked about the vocation of the elderly, beyond what they uh, give, which, you get to the point where you can't produce. And so what value are you to the church or to society? She talks about, they still have a vocation when you're past the point of being productive. And she talks about how vocation is not just about the things that you do for others, but the things that you call out in others. So like the
Mm.
elderly are able to call out, that that human presence in other people, and slowing down and being attentive to vulnerability, and that caring and paying attention to like stories and not like tasks, and like um, presence. So that was all really helpful for me to like reorient my own identity. I mean, I still am like a really driven person, but I come back to that again and again when I come up against my own limits and realize, okay, I can't do that thing that I was planning to do today. Okay, I'm still a valuable person even though I can't do these particular things.
I love that you're like super curious and that you even discovered this um, what you call disability theology. I never even heard that term before. I wouldn't even know that even existed. I'm kind of
Hmm.
curious, like how you like discovered that, and maybe can you share a little bit more about like what disability theology teaches us?
Um, yeah, there's a whole field of disability theology, and um, I'll have to get back to you on like the kind of the key texts that friends that work in the field have referred me to. But it's just looking at like, okay, people are born with disabilities. Does that mean that they're flawed? That God kind of made a mistake when He made these people, and that um, is so much based on what we in society think of as normal, and that comes from what we value as a society, which is in our American capitalist society, is being productive and being, able-bodied and being um, independent and, like upwardly mobile and getting things done.
Hmm.
and and so that is like the norm that we set. And then there's in the disability theology field, there's people with uh, paraplegia or intellectual disabilities, and they don't fit that norm. So they're saying, well, we're still made in the image of God. So what do our bodies, what do our lived experiences have to say about who God is? And can we sort of um, take our lived experiences and like toggle back and forth between like what the what what we've learned about who God is and these characteristics we think of as God having, and often that's some of that is comes out of our own like in capitalist American society, out of what we like imagine ourselves to be, which is like capable and kind of like able to overcome our limitations and to transcend our bodies. Um, and so, like one disability theologian that I really appreciated, the paraplegic, her name is Judith Snow, and she said, like, what if we think about God as a paraplegic? And I read about this in the book. Like, he he calls us like his body. Like Christ is the head, and we are the members of his body. So in a way, like Christ can't do anything in the world without us, because we are like Christ's hands and
Mm,
feet to the world.
mm,
And so that makes God
powerful.
vulnerable and dependent on us almost. And we don't think of God as dependent and vulnerable. We think of God as this unmoved mover, the one who
Hmm.
kind of stands behind everything and kind of is untouched by the suffering or whatever human, um, foibles and things that are happening in the world. So yeah, what does the experience of the people living on the margins have to offer to our vision of God? And that's what I started to move towards more and more as I realized my lived experience was putting me in the margins. It helped me to find a sense of like, okay, I'm not alone, and this
Yeah,
is this is a part of the human experience.
yeah, that's beautiful. And I'm glad you touched on this, like that feeling of like sometimes our value is attached to our productivity or the things that we can do. And I think about like just my own self, like growing up, like my parents very much, wanted me to be they were very, very hard workers. That's they modeled for me. And kind of like your value in society is like how hard you work. And my mom and dad both had two jobs. They were
Hmm.
always working. And when I got into high school, I had two jobs. I really wanted to like show my parents like I'm a hard worker too. I'd go to
Hmm.
school, I'd go to work, and the hard work for me was always like something that was super important to me. And I felt like that's my value to society is how I work. And I think what gets really, really hard is when you start to have um, issues, in my case, mental health issues. Like I have an anxiety disorder, and so um, panic attacks, things like that, where I can't work today because I'm having anxiety, and sometimes that can be perceived as like that's all in basically that's all in your head. You just need to
Hmm.
deal with it. Like just get up, go to work, like
Yeah,
just work
just
through it.
get
Sometimes you
over
can't work
it.
through. Yeah,
Yeah.
sometimes you can't work through it. Sometimes that's why I go
Hmm.
to therapy. Sometimes
Hmm.
you need to take that day off. You need to um, spend time with self care, take care of yourself.
Hmm.
Um, and I think that's really really hard with certain things where people who deal with chronic pain, where there isn't like a certain X-ray that shows something, but that pain is there, or a mental health issue, or those like invisible issues that are harder to see, and sometimes people don't believe they're even real.
Hmm. Yeah, I before I had depression, I remember thinking like, why are these people like having such a hard time? Like, just get up and do it.
Yeah.
Um, but it wasn't until I experienced it myself and I realized you can't just get up and do it. There's some days when you just can't get out of bed, and that's okay
Hmm.
sometimes. And actually, like the the pushing through actually can make it worse because maybe you get over it that day, but then You're not
Yeah.
like kind of unpacking all the things that are within that have led to that moment. And as I growing up, like you talked about your growing up experiences, my parents also, like, they were such hard workers, and I don't think they had a lot of room to deal with whatever traumas and emotional weight that they were carrying from their own histories. And there was so much that I learned from just seeing them that was we just kind of, whenever we like have an argument as a family or something, the next day we just move on and we just
Yeah.
keep
Yeah.
going. And so it just kind of gets like shoved under the table and shoved under the table. And at some point, like all of that becomes too much to carry. And so that can be where it all falls apart. But then we've learned so much to just keep going that, yeah, it can be really challenging to learn new ways to approach those moments where we just can't do the next thing. And instead of pushing through, there's space to give yourself permission not to do the next thing. And that can actually be more helpful because you'll be able to do the next thing eventually. I keep reminding myself of that. Like, I can't do it today, but that doesn't mean I'll never be able to do
Mm.
it again.
You talk about like it's not good to keep pushing it aside because at some point you got to deal with it. Otherwise, there's going to be like an explosion that happens at some point. You keep pushing it away, pushing it away. I'll deal with it later. We'll get through this. We'll just work
Mhm.
through it.
Mhm.
Sometimes that thing's not going away. It's got to be dealt with at some point.
Mhm.
Otherwise, there'll be some sort of crisis that's going to happen. And I think about
Yeah.
that happens also in the faith area too. As a
Mhm.
Christian, I know that my thing has been like, oh, I'll just have faith and just believe I'll get through this pain or I'll get through this thing. And sometimes like that works for so long. Um, and then at some point you can go into this tailspin of like, do I even believe in God anymore? Like this,
Mhm.
and I remember, and some of the trauma I've been through at one point, I remember, and it's still hard for me to say, we say the Lord's Prayer at church. It's like
Mhm.
every week you sing, you say the Lord's Prayer. And there was a period, and I still actually have trouble with the Lord's Prayer because one of the key things you say is "Thy will be done." And
Mhm.
when you're in trauma or you're going through
Mhm.
pain or anything that is devastating to you, that God has allowed to happen. Like I have no desire, like God's will obviously is not something I'm not a fan of right now.
Mhm.
And you know what I mean?
Mhm.
So I've
Mhm.
gone through seasons where everyone's saying the Lord's Prayer out loud, at church,
Mhm.
and I just stay silent in that phrase because
Mhm.
I can't say it.
Yes.
And yeah,
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, it can be like those phrases have been used so much to cover over the pain or dismiss it instead of really facing it head on. I think there's truth to them, like the phrases like God is in control and like God has a perfect timing. I think there's like nuggets of truth behind that, but so much depends on how we say them and the posture of our heart as we're saying them. Is it about um, me trying to get over this thing, or am I really inviting God into that space of desolation and desperation and devastation? Um, we get really scared of those spaces because I was just talking about this in a book discussion group. I asked like what would happen if we actually sat with our vulnerability, and we actually paid attention to it, and we let all the uncomfortable emotions come up. And one woman talked about how she has had children. She's like older now, but when her childbearing years, her children had a lot of learning disabilities, and she was shuttling them back and forth to all these appointments and just trying to get through and make it to the next day. Like, everything was so hard. And she worried that if she stopped to actually feel all the feelings that came with uh, having children with learning disabilities and all of the heartache that brought, that she would just start crying and melt into a
Hmm.
puddle and never be able to get back up and go on. Yeah, um, I wrote about in my book that it just feels like you're like it kind of in an abyss, and you don't want to you don't want to free fall into that, and so you just kind of stay away from it.
Yeah, and I think also what's hard in those moments, especially when you have someone who you love, like sharing with you how they're feeling, like they're processing it out loud and tell, and I do this with my wife. I'll share with her like how I'm feeling, and sometimes, in trying to be helpful, the partner or myself, I get into this like the fix it mode of like, well,
Yeah,
let me solve this, like let me think through some ways that we can deal with this issue, because you're trying to be helpful and you're thinking that that's the
yeah,
helpful response. And many
yeah,
times, like, that's not what I'm looking for. I want to vent. I can probably think of some answers to deal with it, but I don't
yeah,
want answers. I want to be able to be listened to. But that's
yeah,
really hard for me. Like, I have no problem venting,
yeah,
and I want someone to
yeah,
listen to me, but I'm like really bad at listening and just like sitting there with somebody and not trying to offer advice. Like, I struggle with that.
yeah. Um, it's so uncomfortable because you want to help the pain,
Yeah.
you want to relieve the pain for other people, um, and sometimes it's helpful. I think I was talking with another in another podcast interview who, and this interviewer said, you can just ask what they need from you in that moment. That was a really helpful aha moment for me. Like, oh, what do you need from me right now? Would it be helpful for me to like think through solutions with you, or at least like tools that you could like kind of use in this time, or do you just want me to be here? And but yeah, I think we all like don't know what to do with ourselves when we're sitting with another person in pain, and we're worried we're going to say the wrong things, we're going to say something offensive to them, um, and then also it's a feeling of helplessness,
Yeah.
and we don't like that. So, um, but I think yeah, what means has meant the most to me is when people say, like, this is so hard, like I'm feeling this with you, and that sense of being like someone feeling with like empathy, um, it it makes it a little lighter than it did like, minutes ago when I was like kind of like stuck in that place. So we underestimate, I think, the power of simple human presence.
Before we go, I wanted to ask you about, as your kids get older and as you are modeling like how to kind of manage pain and talk about it in the family, and like just like what we just talked about here, when someone's expressing pain, how to respond. And we all want to model like the right behavior for our kids. And as your kids get older, I'm just wondering like what maybe will be some things you'll be doing to maybe help them like see like how we deal with pain and also how we can comfort each other.
I have to say I am still in process. So it's honestly it's easier for me to deal with other people's pain than my own kids' pain or whatever emotional stuff they're going through. It's even more uncomfortable. I'm actually an I'll say therapists are great because I'm actually going to see a therapist about this. Um, I think we write the things that we want to live. So for me, it's like so much more challenging to live out when it's like this day in and day out grind of the people that you live with daily that know you so intimately. And I go back to all those tendencies of, oh, just get over it, and you'll be fine. Like you're fine, you're fine. But in my better moments, I think I want them to know that it's okay to stop. and it's okay to feel what you're feeling. You don't have to um, kind of push it aside to go on. And my second son has dealt with these like recurring tummy aches, and it was more prevalent in his younger years when he didn't have like the verbal language to express it. And that was one of those moments where I felt so helpless to do anything about it and so impatient and angry at him almost for how
Mm-hmm.
he was feeling. And I think the anger came from me feeling so helpless about me not being able to find any way to help him. So, and then I had some better moments where I was able to just hold him and allow him to cry and just say, I'm here and I'm present. And so it seems really basic, but the word presence, I feel like sums up what I want to be for my kids and what I want my kids to learn as they go out into the world, that it's okay to show up to your emotions and to your vulnerability and to all the things that make us uncomfortable, that it's okay to be there and just to feel it. And then as you're feeling it and as you invite God into those spaces, the next thing will come eventually, but you don't have to like force your way to the next thing. You have permission to be in that space where you don't know and you don't have answers, and you don't have to just like come up with something to say or something to do to make it better, but you can just be there.
Yeah, and that's like sometimes the hardest thing. It sounds so simple, but so can be so difficult just to sit and just be present and modeling that for our kids is I love what you just said there about just being present and modeling that for them. Before we go, can you share a little bit about your book, Hurting Yet Whole?
Yeah, so this it covers a lot of the things that we just talked about, and it's my story of kind of reconciling my own pain with how I understand God and my body and what it means to be human. I also bring in a lot of stories of other people that I interviewed who have chronic pain or illness, and I tie in some of my sociological, anthropological training as well as different theological explorations, like including from disability studies, into the conversation. And it came out a week ago from when we were recording. It came out on December 8th with InterVarsity Press, so it's available wherever books are sold.
And it's a fantastic book. Like I told you, like I really enjoyed reading your book. I read the entire book in one night. I read it in the day, and then I finished it up at night. It
Yeah.
was so good.
Yeah, I'm so
Scrolling through and
honored to
reading
hear
it,
that.
it's so good. I was taken in by your storytelling, and then all the data points you shared, the research you pulled in, various theologians. You mixed in anthropologists, sociologists, and then these really amazing stories of different people, how they dealt with pain, and you address so many different issues. Um, Anyways, you're a phenomenal writer. So thank you so much for
Thank
writing it. And for those that want to follow you on social, what are the best channels?
you. You can follow me on Twitter. It's just my name at Liuan Huska, LiuanHuska. And I also have a Facebook profile, author profile, and you can go to my website, which is www.luanhuska.com.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Luann.
Thanks, Mike.
Hey, thank you so much for checking out this video clip from the Delgado podcast. To get more videos like this, simply subscribe here on YouTube. You can also download the full episode of each show on iTunes, Spotify, Google Play, or your favorite podcast player. Take care.